delighted to be talking about the issue of Aboriginal empowerment today. I think it's a very important issue. My belief has always been that the plight of First Nations people in Canada is our defining humanitarian crisis, in the same way that the plight of the black community in inner cities has been the defining humanitarian crisis in the United States for many generations. And it is in that spirit of comparison between Canada and the United States that I'd like to start off by discussing some statistics that at first may not seem like they're related to First Nations issues, but in a minute you'll see why I'm discussing it. The statistics I want to share with you are about the wealth gap between blacks and whites in the United States. This year, there was a study from Brandeis University that showed that the wealth gap between blacks and whites in the United States has been expanding over the last 25 years. The average white household in the United States has assets worth about $265,000. For the average black household in the United States, the figure is about $28,000. So there's almost a 10-to-1 difference between white and black household wealth in the United States. And what's the reason for this? Well, one of the big factors, it turns out, is inequality in home ownership. And I'd just like to quote one paragraph from a CNN report on this. Quote, Brandeis University researchers looked at the same set of 1,700 families over the 25-year period to see how their actual work and school experiences affected their wealth accumulation. What they found is that home ownership is driving the growing gap between blacks and whites. Price appreciation is more limited in non-white neighborhoods, making it harder for blacks to build home equity. Now, this report I'm reading to you, this is about the United States. But the principle that home ownership leads to wealth creation is universal. And why is this relevant to a discussion about Native issues? Because Aboriginal reserves are the only places in Canada where you can't own your own home by law. And in this sense, Canadian Natives are actually at a greater disadvantage than American blacks. Yes, it's very difficult for many American blacks to buy homes in their communities. Sometimes it's difficult for them to get financing, but at least they are legally permitted to do so. In fact, the United States has created an entire legal apparatus and community financing laws that actually encourage black people to buy homes in their neighborhoods. This is actually the opposite from what we have in Canada on reserves, where you're legally prohibited from owning your real estate in fee simple. And in fact, our legal apparatus has the opposite effect from the one in the United States in regard to blacks. Here, the legal apparatus, known as the Indian Act, actually forbids private ownership. And it's always confused me why Idle No More activists don't talk more about this. You know, many of the issues that Idle No More activists talk about in terms of Aboriginal rights are very real. But they don't talk about the private property rights, which to my mind is a fundamental human rights issue. And it's also a fundamental economic rights issue. And why is it an economic rights issue? Well, first of all, lack of home ownership means you can't build savings for retirement. And this is one of the reasons, for instance, why Native elders, who are so respected in Native societies, often become more and more dependent on their youth as they grow older. And often, young people who do leave the reserves to try and start careers often are drawn back to the reserves to take care of their elders who have no retirement savings because they don't own their own property. And so thus you get an intergenerational propagation of poverty. If you don't own your own home, you can't use mortgage financing to start your own business, which of course is the leading way that people create startup financing to start new businesses. In fact, when you go to a reserve, it's actually quite shocking how few small businesses you see. One of the reasons for that is the poverty, but another reason is that even entrepreneurial-minded Aboriginal people who live in reserves have no access, unless they're on band council, which does have access typically to these funds, they have no access to the most common type of financing mechanism that most people in this room take for granted in regard to their own property. The biggest problem to my mind, though, is that without private home ownership, you have no pride of place. You know, when the media broadcasts photos of dilapidated houses on reserves, there's a lot of people who look at those images and they say, how can these people choose to live like that? And the simple answer is that all of us, whatever our race, respond to market incentives. And when people don't own their own properties, it doesn't matter what race they are, they don't have an economic incentive to improve those properties or even to maintain them. It's the same principle that says that nobody takes a rented car to a car wash. That's attributed to Dick Cheney, but I think it preceded Dick Cheney. And in fact, what I've learned from, you've heard before that I was a former engineer. One thing that I find especially troubling is that this goes beyond television images of houses that simply don't look attractive. The issue of people not having an ownership in this ownership stake in their homes becomes a structural engineering issue, because people who don't own their own homes have no stake in maintaining that they're safe. The example I give, the home I live in Toronto was built in 1915. And in the last century, I'm sure dozens of families have lived there. And each has taken care of that property. Some, no doubt, there were handymen in the house who took care of it. In my case, I'm not very good at being handy. I hate home care. But I do it anyway because I own the house. And I don't want it to fall down. And I don't want it to fall into disrepair. And eventually I want to sell it. So I have an economic incentive to keep my property. On reserve, when you don't own your property, and perhaps more importantly, where often there is no enforced building code, people don't have that incentive. And one of the most troubling things, often you'll go to a place like Attawapiskat, where there's a perpetual housing shortage, many of the homes get torn down after 10 years. Even though there are families there who are living 3 generations under the same roof, they still have to tear down the house because there's been mold accumulation, because there's a structural defect. People don't have the incentive to keep up their properties, and so you get a housing shortage despite properties being destroyed after only 10 years. It's actually quite shocking how quickly you can destroy a house. If you have an unventilated plywood basement, as you do on some reserves that don't have building codes, you can actually have mold accumulation within 6 months. And the house can be condemned after 5 years and torn down. And again, this typically will not happen if you have a private homeowner who is safeguarding the value of their property. This situation has led to certain stereotypes about Aboriginal communities. And I find this very unfortunate, because people see images on their TV and they say, oh, these people are choosing to live in a way that other communities don't live. It encourages stereotypes, and I think it's very unfortunate, because what I've learned is that when you visit these communities, you find that Aboriginal people are completely capable of building beautiful homes and caring for them in the same way as any other homeowner, if you give them the right incentive. And the example I give is from an example I saw in Fort Albany, which is a reserve on the west side of James Bay in Ontario. And I visited Fort Albany a couple of months ago, and in many respects, it's a typical reserve. The houses, it's not bad by reserve standards. It's typically cookie-cutter 3-bedroom homes, some in decent shape, some falling apart. And I met a former chief, and he took me around, and I interviewed some people. And then he said, would you like to see my home? I said, sure. And we drove for a few minutes, and he took me to a magnificent log cabin. It's exactly the sort of country house that I, as an urbanite in Toronto, sort of in my fantasy imagine is what people live in the country. Beautiful craftsmanship. He had built it himself. Took him 3 years. His son was building a bed and breakfast across the street. They had their own lumberyard down the road. They were all accomplished tradesmen. And I was standing there in the house. I said, "This is a magnificent home." I'm shocked. Why is this home so much nicer than every other house on the reserve? And he paused a second. He says, "Well, actually, we're not on the reserve. The property line for the reserve is about 300 yards away. We're off the reserve." And it struck me that the reason this guy had invested 3 years of his life building this gorgeous house, and the reason his son was building an even bigger house across the street, was because they knew that this home was theirs to keep, and that they had sweat equity in it, and one day they'd be able to sell it. And it's too bad the media don't focus on images like that, because then people would realize that the reason people aren't building nice homes on reserve and maintaining them has nothing to do with stereotypes. It has to do with the economic incentives people have. And this, I guess, is the larger message I try and tell people about Native policy, is that basically everything is about ordinary economic incentives. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. Eventually, you're going to respond to the same economic incentives that all people respond to. And too much of Native policy in Canada is based on the well-intentioned but fundamentally romantic and misguided idea that Native people are different from everybody else in some existential way that sets them apart from the ordinary rules of economics. And tragically, this just isn't so. You can't take people and put them in a culturally authentic environment and just hope that by dint of the power of their ancestral culture, they will create the right economic institutions. It doesn't happen like that. People abide by the same economic rules wherever they are. And the same principle of incentives works in regard to local governments. For instance, the issue of cronyism and nepotism and corruption that sadly we hear so much about in regard to Native communities. Attawapiskat, which a lot of people have heard about in the last year, is a case in point. Attawapiskat is further north up James Bay from Fort Albany and is in much worse shape than Fort Albany. The housing situation there is very bad, and every year a couple of homes do come, well, I want to say on the market, but it's not on the market. They're provided by Band Council. And I asked some of the locals, I said, so, you've got 12 people in your 3-bedroom house. Are you trying to get a new home? And they say, yeah, we're trying, but it's impossible because unless you have a brother-in-law on Band Council, you're not going to get a home. It's tough. Now, I had no way of confirming whether their stories were accurate, but basically what they were telling me was that unless you had personal nepotistic connections to the housing committee under Band Council, you were not going to get a new home, even when they became available. And that's something that's obviously not true in my neighborhood. In my neighborhood, the house goes to the highest bidder. And it's kind of, we talk about diversity and stuff. To my mind, the biggest engine of diversity in a community is a freely functioning capitalist system, where homeowners, when they want to sell their house, they sell to people on the basis of arm's-length economic transactions, which is why my community in Toronto, like communities in Vancouver, is so diverse. You don't have people exercising home buying and home selling decisions on the basis of ethnicity or who your family members are or whether you're related to someone in city government, but on the basis of dollars and cents. And let me tell you something else about my neighborhood. You might have heard of the mayor of my city. It's a guy named Rob Ford. I like talking about Rob Ford because I have a friend who travels around and sometimes people will hear he's from Toronto and they'll say Rob Ford. They'll just open a conversation. They want to talk about Rob Ford. And he does have a clownish reputation in Toronto. But we write about him, and I write about him as a journalist. And why do we care so much about this guy if he's a clown? And the reason is that whether he's a clown or not, he is the mayor of Toronto, and he presides over a multi-billion-dollar budget. And furthermore, that multi-billion-dollar budget is funded out of property taxes that people like me pay. And that's why we keep tabs on him. Both as a journalist and as a Toronto resident, I keep tabs on this guy because I have skin in the game through the property taxes I pay. And again, this goes back to one of the problems with the reserve model. On a reserve, funding for operations does not come from locally levied property taxes. It comes from lump sum disbursements that are made from Ottawa. The result is that when you talk to people on reserves, there's actually very little civic connection between these ordinary residents and their Band Council. I mean, sometimes they'll be friends with people on Band Council, and they will look to Band Council sometimes to solve their problems. But they don't have the same kind of civic connection with their Band Council that I do with my local political representatives because there's no tax connection. There's no holding people to account through tax money. And we've all heard of the principle of no taxation without representation, but the opposite applies in my mind. There's no representation without taxation. It's the act of paying taxes, as much as voting, that provides a civic connection between leaders and those they lead. And this is something that's lacking in reserves. I would also add that aside from all this, the lack of private property creates a general contempt for the idea of binding contracts, which is one of the pillars of capitalist society. And again, Attawapiskat is a great example. Attawapiskat has an extremely well-defined benefits agreement with the De Beers Mining Corporation, which operates the Victor Mine, which is a leading job provider. It's 90 kilometers west of Attawapiskat. And it's actually extraordinary what De Beers provides the Attawapiskat community as part of this benefits agreement, even though the Victor mine actually isn't even on Attawapiskat property. De Beers builds schools, De Beers provides homes, De Beers provides millions of dollars in job training. You have dozens of people from Attawapiskat who work at the Victor mine, all of them trained in things like heavy equipment operation by De Beers. And again, this is, to a certain extent, this is all part of this defined contractual obligation between De Beers and Attawapiskat. But this past winter, when there was a disagreement between the residents of Attawapiskat and De Beers in regard to the treatment of some Attawapiskat residents, they had been fired from the Victor mine for various reasons, the contract went out the window. What happened was you had some local hotheads from Attawapiskat who blockaded the winter road between Attawapiskat and the Victor mine, which is the only way you can get heavy equipment there. And the mine was effectively being held for ransom. And the company, as companies all over Canada do, had to basically ignore the terms of the negotiated contract and sit down and create a payout for various people in order to get their operation going. So what you essentially do is you have a breakdown in the rule of law and the enforcement of contracts. And in the short run, this might be good for the activists who are putting pressure on the corporations, but in the long run, this is bad for Aboriginal communities. Because if corporations can't count on enforceable contracts in regard to their dealings with Aboriginal communities, it's an enormous discouragement for them doing business with these communities. And I want to emphasize that this isn't because of some stereotype that says natives are angrier or more law-breaking than any other group in society. It's because of the incentives we've set up. If you set up reserves as welfare states where there's no private real estate, no private tax base, you're always going to get people who believe that political agitation and not business success is the best way to enrich oneself. It has nothing to do with who you are, it has to do with the incentives that have been created. Now this is the bad news, is the institutionalized discouragement toward private enterprise, which is part of the reserve system. And by the way, I say all this as someone, at the National Post, I'm considered a communist. Terry Corcoran thinks I'm very left-wing in my views. Peter Foster, Larry Solomon, they think I'm quite left. So I'm not a free market Puritan, but I am someone who's looked around the world and looked at compared societies like North Korea and Cuba with the kind of society we have. And I see many of the same pathologies that exist in all collectivist societies existing on our reserve system. Are things changing? Things are changing to a certain degree. One of the nice things is that on a lot of reserves, like in James Bay, you now have the internet. As recently as 5 years ago, it was very difficult to communicate with these places, let alone get to them. Now, every place I go in these communities, they're wired for Wi-Fi. And it's fantastic because now the people there, they can see the opportunities that are in the outside world. It's transformed education there. It's transformed the media. It means everyone there can download Fraser Institute reports anytime they want. Monitor your hit counter, see where those hits are coming from. That is actually a huge thing, and it's going to shape Aboriginal culture for decades to come. The other thing is you are getting more of a spirit of professionalization on band council. 20 years ago, you would talk to people on a band council, and typically, often they'd be part of the same family. It was very clannish. The people might not have a great education. The band council people I talk to, these are typically people with at least trade school education, college education. There's a huge emphasis on sobriety. You get child welfare workers who are in council. You get contractors who are in council. You get a new generation of more educated Aboriginals who are running band councils, at least in Ontario. I'm not sure what the situation is on a reserve-to-reserve basis, but to me that's good news. You get improved language skills. A lot of the Cree band leaders I spoke to, they said, look, 50 years ago, a lot of the people around here only spoke Cree. Few people spoke English or French, and that's changing. You're having better language skills. So there are reasons to change, but none of those things can change the biggest problem, which is a cultural idea that has become well established in Canada, especially in activist movements, especially on the Supreme Court of Canada, and especially in our universities, that says that the measure of what we do to promote Aboriginal welfare resides in what we do to promote collective Aboriginal rights in the form of treaty entitlements, in the form of land claims, and in the form of the annual disbursements we make from Ottawa to First Nations. That mindset that says that basically we have to create a network of kibbutzes across Canada, and just eventually, if we give them enough money and power, that they're going to economically flourish, that attitude, to my mind, is the real impediment to progress in Canada. And I agree with Gordon Gibson, Fraser Institute scholar, that we can't forcibly assimilate people into our economic system. And it would be a mistake to go to remote reserves and say, guess what, we're waving the magic wand, all of this property is now individually held, good luck. That's not something you can do. It's taken generations to build this system, and it's going to take generations to change the system. So I do think it's going to take time. It has to be done voluntarily in collaboration with entrepreneurial First Nations. But in the long run, private property rights are going to be the solution. And I think it should be the mission of groups like this one to prepare Aboriginals for that coming transition. Because only then are you really going to address the roots of what, to my mind, is the biggest humanitarian crisis facing Canada. Thank you very much for your attention.